Hello guys and welcome to my channel. In this tutorial we will work on the Pane Sweater, the one that I'm wearing right now. Unfortunately I don't have the step-by-step tutorial as I worked this sweater in one weekend and I wasn't able to film everything, but then I started to work on the tutorial, on the video tutorial, and I will show you the main things that you'll need to know about the construction, how these rectangles are worked, how we're joining the rectangles as we go, how to shape the neckline and everything. So let's jump into the tutorial, and I hope that following this along with the written pattern you will be able to make this sweater. First, let's talk about the yarn that we are using. So I used Katia Merino Aran, which is a worsted weight yarn. I use for size small, which we are working in this tutorial, I used 7 balls of yarn in 5 different colors. So for 2 colors we will need 2 balls of yarn. Each ball has 100 meters and 100 grams and approximate 155 meters. So we will work this yarn with a 6mm crochet hook. The maximum recommended is 5.5 millimeter, but I like it a bit of a drape on this sweater, so I used a bigger crochet hook. And after that we will talk about the structure, and then we will jump into the tutorial to see how the actual rectangles are worked. You can see here on the screen the chart for back and front panel. We will start with the front panel, and as you can see we will start it into the left of the screen, and the crochet direction is from bottom to top. Basically we are working this first row of squares, working the same stitch pattern, only that we're changing color in this particular pattern for size small after 10 rows. Then we will rejoin for the second row of squares, and we will start repeating the same pattern, only that we will have to join the squares, the current squares, with the ones that we made at the previous row. On the third row of squares we will also have to shape the neckline, and then we will continue with the back panel from where we are, without changing anything, just adding more rows of squares until completing the back panel. And the sleeves are worked into the armhole, just starting to pick up your stitches for the sleeves, and then start working in the same stitch pattern, no squares this time, so just row by row working flat until you will have the desired length. For the sleeves you will have to use the remaining yarn that you have from all the colors. Doesn't matter if you will reach to have 10 rows with one color, then continue with the others one that you have. Because I had more from the dark gray color, I just used to make the middle of the sleeves more rows using this color. So now let's just start working on the actual squares, and let me show you how to work this sweater. Okay, so this is my yarn. I will work with leftover yarns because I don't have nothing from the colors that I actually use for the sweater. And I was telling you at the beginning of this tutorial that I didn't manage to film everything when actually working on the sweater. So now I'm using the same yarn, so it's Katia Merino Aran, only that I have some colors left, so we will work with this one. So we will start by chaining 21 stitches. This is for size small. For the other sizes, or if you want to adjust the length of the sweater, you can just simply work more stitches. Then chain 3, and starting into the 6th chain we will work a half double crochet. Then we will chain 1 and then skip the next stitch and work 1 half double crochet into the next one. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch and 1 half double crochet into the next stitch, and we will continue like this until the end of the row. Okay, so I finished the first row. Now the next row will be into half double crochet stitches, so you will have to work 1 half double crochet into each stitch. So I chained 2, then I will go into the next 1 chain space and work 2 stitches. You can either work like this or simply work 1 half double crochet into each stitch and into each chain spaces. And we will continue until the end of the row. So now at the end of the row we will simply chain 3 and we will alternate 1 row in this mesh stitch using half double crochet stitches, and 1 solid row with 1 half double crochet into each stitch. And we will have to repeat these 2 rows until we will have in total 10 rows. Again, if you need to work the sweater into a bigger size, then maybe you will have to adjust the number of stitches that you want to start for 1 square, and also the number of rows if you want your sweater to be wider. So now I will simply go and repeat until we will have in total 10 rows, and then we will start to change the color. Okay, so I finished 1 square, so the first 10 rows, and now we will change the color. When we change the color, we simply finish the last stitch with the next color that we will want to use. So I have a light gray in this case. We can cut the other color and we will continue with the same pattern. So now my next row is mesh stitch row, so I will start with chain 3, skip the next stitch and go into the next one and work 1 half double crochet. Then chain 1, skip 1 stitch and go into the next stitch and make 1 half double crochet. And we will continue to add 10 rows in this color, and then we will change the color again, and we will continue like this until we will have in total 5 squares or rectangles. So this will be the first row of squares, and then we will start to work on the second one, and with the second one I will show you how to join the squares. Okay, so I finished 3 squares. This will be the sample that I will work for the purpose of this tutorial. So I won't work all 5 squares, but you will need to have 5 for this first row of squares. And now let's see how we will start the second row of squares. So I will start in this gray color. And when you finish adding all 5 squares, you simply will have to cut the yarn, and we will rejoin the yarn. I will show you right away where. So now I turned my work on the right side, so this is the right side of my work, and we will have to rejoin yarn into the first stitch at the bottom of the first square. So over here, and I will rejoin the color that I will want to use for this square. On the written pattern you will have a measurement diagram in which I put the exact colors that I used. Also into the chart, they are in the squares are in the exact same colors that I use, and how I place the colors. Now after joining the yarn you will have to chain 21 stitches, so we will start the same, then chain 3, and starting with the third stitch, the sixth stitch, work 1/2 double crochet, then you'll have to chain 1, skip 1 stitch, and work another 1/2 double crochet, and we will repeat until we will get to the end, and I will show you right away how to make the join with the first row of squares. Okay, so I have one more stitch until a few more stitches until getting at the end of this foundation chain of the second row. So now I will work the last 1/2 double crochet, and then we will need to join this row with the previous row of square. So first we are looking at the first row and going into the top stitch, so it has to be the end of the row, and work 1 slip stitch, and going into the top stitch of the edge stitch and work a slip stitch, and then we will turn. And because now we will have to work a solid row, I will just start into the first 1 chain space and work 2 1/2 double crochet, and then going into each space and work 2 1/2 double crochet until completing the row. If you want, you can simply work 1 1/2 double crochet into each stitch, starting into the chain 1 chain space, the first 1 chain space. The idea is that you will need to end up with 21 1/2 double crochet at the end of this row, counting 1 stitch as being the 2 slip stitches that we use for the join. And then after turning the row, we will chain 3, skip the next stitch, and we will continue working the mesh stitch row, and at the end of this row we will proceed the same and joining the current row with the row from the first row of squares that we did. So the same with those 2 slip stitches that has to be done into the edge of into the side rows, and making that slip stitch into the top stitch from the edge. And you can look at the correspondent row like this. I need to put a slip stitch into the top stitch of the mesh stitch row, and then going with 1 slip stitch to just high and for the turning row, because we need to do those 2 chain stitches to turn the row. So this is why we are doing another slip stitch to be able to turn, and we will continue like this and adding those squares. Again, after 10 rows you will need to change the color and work 5 squares or rectangles until you complete this second row of square. And you will have to join all the time the rows when you meet the first row of squares with the corresponding stitches. So the mesh stitch row has to you will need to slip stitch into the top stitch of the mesh stitch row of the previous rows of squares, and then going with another slip stitch into the solid row, and then turn. So you'll have to complete all the 5 squares. I have the actual sweater here because I'm working only on sample, so you'll have to continue working in the same way, adding all 5 squares until you complete the second row of squares. And then I will work with you the third rows of squares. You'll have to make the first one in the same way as you work the first square of the second rows of squares. And then with the second one, because we need to shape the neckline, we will work together the second square, the third and the fourth, where is the neckline shaping. So now what you'll need to do is just complete and adding all 5 squares for the second row, then work the first square of the third row, and now we will work together with the second square of the third row. So I will have to work and you will have to work from the second square, so this is the second square, the first 7 rows. So here are my first 7 rows, because starting with row 8 we will start to decrease for the neckline. So now I'm starting with row 8. I already did the slip stitches at the end of the row, so my row is joined with the previous rows of squares. And now I will start the row as usual by working 2 half double crochet into the first space and then continue, but I won't go into each space. So into the last space we will leave it like this, because we will decrease with 2 stitches at the end of this row. And to make that decrease, we simply stop working into those 2 stitches. So we let them like this without working into them. And this will be the first decrease that we will do. Basically we're decreasing on the last 3 rows of the second square, because it's the second square, and then the third will be worked with the remaining stitches, and for the fourth square we will need to increase again, so to make that neckline shaping. So now let's continue and work half double crochet stitches into each one chain space, or if you decided to work not 2 half double crochet into each space but 1 half double crochet into each stitch, you simply have to go until you have 2 stitches left. So basically the last space, and then we will turn. And now, because it's a mesh stitch row, we will chain 3, skip the next stitch and go, we need to decrease again. So I'm going with slip stitches until I will with 2 slip stitches. So we need to skip 2 stitches to decrease 2 stitches at the beginning of this row again. So 2 slip stitches until we are on the 3rd stitch and starting the row from there. Sorry for the mistake. Okay, so I just ended up the 8th row with 2 stitches before, and then the row 9 I started with slip stitches just to decrease 2 more stitches, and now I'm working the mesh stitch row, so we will need to end up with 8 spaces instead of 10 as we had on a complete square. So let's continue and finish this row. Now we will join the row. So those 2 slip stitches and then turn. And now it will be the last row in this color and the last row with the decrease. So at the end of the row we will leave the last 2 stitches or the last space without working into it. And into the last stitch we will have to change the color because the second square is done, and we will change the color and work the third square. In my sample is the second, but in the actual sweater has to be the third. So we will work the third square as usual, as normal, only that with the remaining stitches. So no decreasing, no increasing yet, just work a regular square, only that this time you will have less stitches than into a complete square. And then we will start working the fourth square, in which we will have to make those increasing to get to the number of stitches that we need for one complete square. So let's work together the third square, and then we will meet to see how to work the fourth square, which is with increasing. Okay, so I finished the third square. This is my last row, and now I will have to change the color, and we will start with the fourth square. So this was the third, and now we will start with the fourth, and we will need to increase this time. So for the first 3 rows of the square number 4, we will need to increase. So basically work the reverse of the square number 2. So I chain 3. It's a mesh stitch row, and to make the increase I will do 1/2 double crochet into the same first stitch. So in this way we are increasing with one space, which is the thing that we need to do for the first row. Then we will continue with the row as usual until getting to the end, and then of course joining with the correspondent row on the previous row of squares. Too many row words. Actually, this sweater is so simple to make, but explaining everything and doing everything, it's much harder than it looks. Okay, so now we're joining the mesh row, and then we will start with a solid row, and at the end of the solid row we will have to increase again with 2 stitches. And let's see how we will going to do this. So I will start the row as usual by working 2/2 double crochet stitches into each space, or if you don't want to work into the chain spaces, then only into the chain spaces, you'll have to work 1/2 double crochet into each stitch, either that it's a 1/2 double crochet or a chain space. So at the end of the row, to increase those stitches that we need, we will do some foundation 1/2 double crochet, because otherwise if we are doing into the last stitch 3 stitches here, like here into the last stitch, we will need to work besides the stitch that we already did, to work 2 more stitches or 3 more stitches to increase and have the last stitch, which will be too much, and it will be too many stitches in only one stitch. So this is not the way that we were doing. So instead of having that bulk of stitches into one single stitch, we will work foundation half double crochet. So for this, you'll need to yarn over, insert the hook into the side of the last stitch, pull out the loop, yarn over and pass it through the first loop on your hook, and then yarn over and pass it through all 3 loops. And then to make the second one, you'll need to go into the bottom of the previous stitch, which you'll see that is a small V right there, and there is where you'll need to insert the hook and repeat again the same thing. And again, you will need to have with 2 stitches more, okay? Then you'll chain 3 and turn, and because we need to make another increase in the right very first stitch, you will need to make 1 half double crochet. And at the end of this row, you will need to end up with the same number of stitches as for a regular square or rectangle, because this was the last increase that we needed to do. And then after finishing this row, we will continue to work the square number 4 with the entire number of stitches, and we will work it until like until now, adding those rows until finishing the 10 rows that we need to do in this color. Then you will change the color again, and you will need to work the square number 5. After finishing this third row of rows of square, basically the front panel is done, and we will start working the back panel in the same manner as we were adding these squares. We will start adding for the back panel as well. The only difference will be on this 3 squares that we have over here, so the square number 2, number 3 and number 4, but only for the first row, because for the first rows of square we will need to not to make the join on the neckline. Okay? Okay, so now what we need to do next after completing this first 3 rows is to finish the 4th square, then make the 5th square with the other color, and then work the first square of the back panel, because that will be entirely joined with the corresponding square on the front panel, and then we will meet at the square number 2, where we will start working these 3 squares that I was talking about, that are worked a bit different, because we will join only the first rows of the second square, then we will need to work this neckline without joining, and then again to start joining again. So now you are on the second square, so you don't need to join the yarn like I do, because you already did it on the first square. But if you just start working on the back panel, this is the same way that you'll need to join the yarn and work the first square. And so I will rejoin the yarn into the first stitch of the corresponding square, then chain 21, chain 3, and starting with the 6th stitch you will work the mesh stitch pattern. And you will need to work the first square by joining the end of the mesh stitch row with the corresponding row of the corresponding square, and as well the first 7 rows of the second square, because those rows are is basically until we started to decrease for the neckline. So the first square and the first 7 rows of the second square needs to be worked as usual by joining the mesh stitch row with the correspondent row. And then we will start to see, basically it's not a big deal, we just for the neckline we simply have to work the rows as normal without making that join. Okay, so let's finish this rows until we will get to the neckline. Okay, so I finished the first 7 rows and now I joined with we need to join with a mesh stitch row because it's row number 7 with row number 7. But then, because the next row, the 8th row, is already with a decrease, we simply need to chain 2 and turn. And then start working 1/2 double crochet into each stitch until the end of the row. So basically we will chain 2 at the end of or at the beginning of the turning row for a solid row, and this will not count as the first half double crochet, and we will chain 3 when we will have a mesh stitch row, and we will have to work like this the last 3 rows of the square number 2, the entire square number 3, and the first 3 rows of the square number 4. And at the end of the row 3 of square number 4, we will need to start joining again because we will need to finish the last 7 rows of the square number 4, and those rows needs to be joined with the correspondent square. So now let's just continue and adding those rows. So now we will work 3 rows, the last 3 rows of square number 2 without joining, and then change the color, work the square number 3 without joining, change the color, work the first 3 rows of square number 4 without joining, and we will meet at the end to see how we will go further with the scales and finish the square number 4. Okay, so I finished the square number 3. I just changed the color for the last 2 rows of square number 3 because I didn't had this dark purple. Now it's time to start the square number 4, and even if it's the same color as the previous one, you will need to change the color at the end of the square number 3. And now the first 3 rows of the square number 4 will be the same without making the join, and only starting with at the end of row number 3 we will start to join the with the correspondent square. So now let's work this 3 rows and then see how we will go back to the join. With the slip stitches. Okay, so this was how we did this join. And now basically we are working the square number 4, finishing the square number 4 with joining with the previous, with the correspondent squares, and we will continue the same with the square number 5, and then for the back panel we will need to add 2 more rows of square in the same way as we worked the basically the second row of squares on the front panel, because this will be that it was the row, the complete row with all the squares joined. So now we will finish the square number 4 and then continue with the square number 5, and then we will need to add 2 more rows of squares. Okay, so let's pretend that we finish front panel, back panel, everything is in order. So now that we have both panels joined together, we need to work the sleeves. So for the sleeves, I had in total 51 stitches for the sleeve, and of course that this 51 stitches has to be divided into front and back panel. You will need to have a number of an uneven number of stitches for the sleeves as well, because we will follow the same pattern with mesh stitch row and alternate it with a solid row. So in order to do that, we will need a multiple of 2 plus 1 stitches. So for the sleeves again, so for size small, we will have 51 stitches in total. So this is my actual sweater, and as I said with the colors, so you will simply alternate one solid row with one mesh stitch row, and for the colors you will need to work with whatever you have left. I said that I used 5 colors, but for the black, dark gray and beige I had 2 balls of yarn, so I used mainly toward the main sleeve with that color. Then after finishing the sleeves, to assemble the sweater you will simply have to fold it in half and stitch the sides. So this is the actual sweater that I have, and I will show you now how to work the ribbing. For the bottom and for the neckline, before start working on the actual ribbing pattern, you will need to work one row in single crochet stitches. And because you are working into the side rows, you can adjust the number of stitches that you are making according with your tension. I worked 2 single crochet into each side row, but if you feel that there are too many stitches, then you can skip and make in one side row to make only 1 single crochet instead of 2. And then after finishing for the bottom and neckline this row in single crochet, basically then you can start working on the ribbing pattern, and I will show you how I made the ribbing pattern and which pattern did I use for ribbing. For the sleeves, it's not mandatory to work the first row in single crochet, but you can do it if you want. So to start working on the ribbing pattern, I will just simply chain 11 or 7 or 8 depending on how thick you want your ribbing to be. And then starting with the second stitch, you will start to single crochet into each stitch until you'll get to the end of the chain stitch and at the edge of the sleeve. And then we will join with slip stitches with the next 2 stitches of the sleeve edge. Okay, and then we will join with the slip stitches, so we will do 1 slip stitch into the next 2 stitches of the edge. Either if it's the sleeves edge or the neckline's edge or the bottom edge is the same, so just go with the slip stitches into the next 2 stitches. Then turn, and we will work slip stitches into each single crochet stitch until the end of the row. So simply slip stitches going through both loops, so not only into the back loops. Of course that you can make any ribbing pattern that you want. I wanted at first to go for a slip stitch in the back loop only, but then the neckline was too tight and I changed it into this one. Next, we will have to work single crochet stitches, but the slip stitch creates 2 V stitches, so 2 pairs of stitches, one on the in front of our work and one in the back. So we will work single crochet stitches but into the V that is in the back of our work, and work single crochet stitches until the edge, and then join with 2 stitches into the with 2 slip stitches into the next 2 stitches of the edge. And then we will have to repeat these 2 rows until we complete the entire sleeve or the entire bottom hem or the entire neckline, depending where on which section of the sweater we are working the ribbing. So now I'm slip stitching into the next 2 stitches of the edge and turn. And now I'm working slip stitches through both loops. So now not only into the back loop or into the front loop, so through both loops. And then the single crochet stitches, after turning our work, we need to work them into the V that is behind our work. And now that we finish the ribbing, we will simply join the ends using slip stitches, or you can use a thread needle and stitch together this ribbing ends. And as I said, you'll have to repeat the same pattern on the other cuff, on the other sleeve, and also on the bottom hem and on the neckline. But on the neckline and bottom, you'll need to make first 1 round in single crochet stitches. And after finishing with this ribbing, forgot to tell you that there will be a few ends to weave in, and but after ribbing the sweater is done. And I really hope that this tutorial was helpful, because now after recording it, I'm just feeling that I don't know, that it was too difficult for me to explain what I did, but the actual sweater is really simple. So I hope that this tutorial will help, and if not, believe me that I did my best to just work this sample and explain it to you what I did without having to make the entire sweater again, because there is a lot of work even if I did it in one single weekend. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for watching, and I will wait for you next time. Bye bye.